Three men walked into a tiny military reactor to finish what should have been a routine repair. Minutes later, the reactor exploded. Investigators would eventually prove almost exactly what happened inside that room. They could measure the damage, rebuild the blast, and determine how far one control rod had been pulled. But the only three men who could explain why were already dead. On the night of January 3rd, 1961, a small reactor called SL-1 sat alone in the frozen Idaho desert. It had been built by the United States Army to provide heat and electricity at remote military bases. The reactor had been shut down over Christmas and was scheduled to restart the next morning. Before that could happen, three military operators had one final maintenance job. Their names were John Burns, Richard McKinley, and Richard Legg. They were alone inside the building. Their task seemed simple. They had to reconnect the reactor's central control rod to the motor that moved it. To reach the connection point, they only needed to lift the rod about 3 inches. Control rods absorb neutrons and slow a nuclear chain reaction. Push them deeper into the reactor and power drops. Pull them upward and power rises. SL-1 had several control rods, but the one in the center was unusually powerful. Pulling that single rod too far could turn a quiet reactor into something almost impossible to stop. The rods had caused trouble before. Some had become difficult to move, and crews had sometimes worked them loose by hand. But no one knows exactly what happened that night. At 9:01 p.m., a heat alarm sent a coded signal to nearby fire stations. One long signal, then two short ones. Inside the reactor building, someone had pulled the central control rod far beyond the 3 inches required. The reactor went prompt critical. That meant the nuclear reactor was growing too quickly for any person or machine to stop it. In about 4 thousandths of a second, the reactor's power jumped from almost nothing to nearly 20 billion watts. The heat flashed part of the water around the fuel into steam. Water above the core was driven upward like a giant piston and slammed into the lid of the reactor vessel. The pressure reached around 10,000 pounds per square inch. The vessel jumped roughly 9 feet into the air, struck the ceiling, and crashed back into place. Metal shield plugs, fuel pieces, water, and radioactive debris blasted across the room. 2 of the men were killed almost instantly. One was thrown into heavy equipment. Another was driven upward and pinned to the ceiling by an ejected shield plug. The third suffered massive head injuries, but his heart continued beating for nearly 2 hours after it happened. Outside, there was no obvious sign that anything had happened. The first firefighters reached the locked gate about 9 minutes after the alarm. They saw no flames, no damaged roof, no one running toward them, only a thin trail of steam rising into the freezing night. They entered the support area and called out for the crew. No one answered. In one room, they found 3 lunch pails sitting on a table, but the men were nowhere in sight. The firefighters moved toward the stairs leading to the reactor floor. That was when their radiation meter began to climb. They backed away and called for more help. Additional crews arrived with protective suits and strong meters. As they moved closer to the reactor room, the readings became so high that one instrument actually reached its limit. By about 10:30 that night, a rescue team was finally allowed to enter. The room was flooded. Small iron pellets from the shielding rolled beneath their boots like marbles. Their masks fogged as they tried not to slip. They saw one man who was clearly dead. Then they noticed movement from another. Radiation inside the room may have reached 1,000 roentgens per hour. The rescuers were allowed to remain inside for only 60 seconds. They lifted the injured man onto a stretcher and rushed him outside. An ambulance met them on the road, but he could not be saved. He was pronounced dead around 11 p.m. The radiation coming from his body was so strong that the medical team had nowhere safe to place him. The ambulance sat outside in the sagebrush while officials decided what to do. At around 4 in the morning, workers tried to remove his contaminated clothing beneath the headlights of 2 cars. The temperature was close to 20 degrees below zero. His wet clothing had frozen solid. Using heavy tools, the workers cut it away in about 1 minute and 17 seconds. It barely lowered the radiation. The third man was still inside. Investigators feared that moving his body could knock debris into open spaces below and possibly trigger another chain reaction. A photographer was sent inside for 1 minute. Using his pictures, crews built a full-size copy of the reactor area and practiced the recovery. On January 9th, 8 men entered in 2-person teams. Each pair was limited to 65 seconds. They used a crane, a net, and a special stretcher to bring the final body down. Even the autopsies had to be performed with long-handled tools because radioactive metal had been driven into the men's bodies. Their remains were placed in lead-lined caskets and returned to their families. Then investigators began rebuilding the final seconds before the explosion. They removed the reactor vessel and examined it piece by piece. Inside the central rod mechanism, they found scratch marks showing how far the rod had moved. It had not been raised 3 inches. It had been pulled more than 20 inches upward. The mechanism recorded a point of 26 and 1/4 inches before the explosion drove it back down. Investigators concluded that the rod had been withdrawn by hand. No other explanation matched the physical evidence, but they could not determine who pulled it, and they could not determine why. The most likely explanation may be painfully simple. The rod could have been stuck. One of the men may have pulled harder, felt it suddenly break free, and lost control before they could stop it. Another theory was that the crew had been moving the rod up and down to loosen it. Later stories suggested horseplay, suicide, or even murder-suicide. Those claims were never proven. The official investigation could explain the explosion. It could not explain the decision that caused it. What the accident did reveal was a serious design failure. No reactor should have been able to explode because one person pulled one control rod too far. After SL1, reactor designs and operating rules changed. Future systems were built so removing a single control rod would not cause the same disaster. Emergency radiation equipment improved. Procedures became stricter. The damaged reactor, contaminated equipment, and surrounding soil were eventually buried in the Idaho desert. SL1 remains the only fatal nuclear reactor accident in United States history. Investigators solved the physics. They measured the rod. They studied the marks. They rebuilt the explosion almost millisecond by millisecond. But they never solved the human moment at the center of it. Someone placed their hands on that rod. Someone pulled it. And because all 3 men died inside the room, no one will ever know whether it was a mistake, a desperate attempt to free a stuck machine, or something else entirely. If you like true stories, disasters, mysteries, and the moments where everything went wrong, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching.